So I'm now welcoming our first guest, Dr. Stefan Schmitz, Executive Director of the Global Crop Diversity Trust. So this is the only organization in the world that focuses on building and supporting a global system of gene banks for the conservation of crop diversity. So outside of the seaweed field, but good to take inspiration of. Stefan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Melanie. And hello, everybody. For those who do not know me yet, I'm Stefan Schmitz, the Executive Director of the Global Crop Diversity Trust, or Crop Trust for short. The Crop Trust has been established 20 years ago and operates within the framework of the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture. This is quite important. This is for us the framework and the overarching legal body under which we operate. I will come back to this later. Next slide, please. Just without further ado, I will go into it and hope I can inspire you a little bit. I think the landscape we are working in, the landscape of challenges is almost the same. We are all aware of, no need to go into detail. This global food insecurity is a main challenge for us in the middle of a lot of challenges with climate change, biodiversity loss, pandemic, and so on, and so on. Next slide, please. So why crop diversity? What is our starting point? A very, very quick round of introduction here. Next slide, please. Crop diversity ticks a lot of developmental boxes. So the plant genetic resources, the rationale, why collect them, why conserve them, why use them, very important. It addresses climate resilience. It is more resource efficiency with crop diversity. We can aim as less perishable crops, higher yielding crops, more diverse cultivation, and last but not least, more nutritious crops. Next slide, please. So with that, diversity exists between different crop species, as you see here. Next slide, please. And this is starting from various centers of origins around the world, origins and primary regions of the world. This is a very, very broad landscape of the diversity of agricultural crops. Next slide, please. Next, yes, we have, you can, yes, that's it. Well, there we have a lot of well-researched crops with professional breeding, well used, less well-researched, little professional breeding. This is a middle category, and a lot of unresearched crops with no professional breeding under use. This is a diversity on species level. Next slide, please. But diversity exists also within individual crop species. Next slide. And exists within individual crop varieties down to the genetic level. So diversity on many different levels, this is man-made biodiversity created over the last 12,000 years when men started to go into agriculture. Next slide, please. So, but why crop diversity is becoming more important, it's under growing threat. In the fields, due to, homogenization, standardization, industrialization of our agriculture, it is under threat in nature where the so-called crop wild relatives come from. And the crop wild relatives are likewise important when it comes to identifying genetic traits that helps us to breed new varieties with certain properties to be more resilient, more nutritious, higher yielding, and so on. And they are under growing threat in gene banks that has been established as long as those gene banks are not properly funded. And this is one of the concerns, and that is where the crop trust comes into play. Next slide, please. The loss of biodiversity of crops is real when looking what happened. This is an example taking from the US, what happened within only 1 century. A lot of different varieties in the market, and 80 years later, so much reduced to only a very few very few crops. At least 90% of vegetable varieties, for example, in the US have gone extinct since 1903. Next slide. Yeah. This is how a properly financed, properly funded, maintained gene bank looks like, but that's unfortunately not the reality all over the world. Next slide, please. This is far closer to reality in many, many parts of the world, and that is exactly where the crop trust comes into play. We are a grant provider based on our endowment fund, our own assets. So we are a grant provider for gene banks all over the world. So we are a secondary donor in our own. On the other hand, we are a technical cooperation provider based on various projects we are running. Next slide, please. So coming back to the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture, this is a global legal framework for the conservation and use of plant genetic resources for food and agriculture, and in particularly under Article 15 of that treaty, and in Annex 1, it is clearly laid out where the crop trust is positioned. Next slide, please. Yeah, it is about conservation and making available for use. In the middle of that, here in this blue box, the gene bank essential operation. This is at the heart of our concern. It's about the long-term conservation, safety duplication, regeneration and characterization, the monitoring, data management, acquisition and distribution. This is our main focus. You might add plant health here as well. So sometimes plant health is included in this one, sometimes not, doesn't matter much. But there is a lot of other work that needs to be done. On the one hand, marked in red here, the continued efforts to collect threatened crop diversity in fields and crop-like relatives and natures, collect them and bring them to gene banks. The upgrading and capacity building in gene banks is a constant threat. But with all of that, of course, we do not want to create museums of crop diversity. We need to make sure that everything in the gene banks is made available for researchers, for breeders, but also directly to farmers when it comes to repatriation of resources to the fields. Next slide, please. Yeah, there are lots of gene banks around the world. At FAO, there are more than 1,700 registered one, many of them pretty small, but also some of them quite important. Next slide, please. So with the global gene bank, global system of gene bank conservation, it is our understanding the entirety of all the gene banks, and the whole is more than the sum of its part. And we see 4 different levels here. On top is the so-called Svalbard Global Seed Vault. I will come back to this in a minute. This is a very unique gene bank or seed bank, as this only holds safety duplicates. It is not a working collection where breeders and researchers constantly withdraw material from. It is just a security backup. A second level are the international collections. 18 of them are recognized by FAO with on specific status as international ones. Then the entirety of the national seed banks, the national collections, and at the very bottom, lots of community collection that goes further down into conservation in fields, the so-called in situ conservation. And the Crop Trust promotes the collaboration among gene banks and their integration into a global system. We are pushing for increasing efficiency, effectiveness, working close together, and so on. Next slide, please.
Yeah.
Next. Yes. So as said, there are about 1,750 registered gene banks today. 130 of them with more than 10,000 accessions or seed samples. 18 of them that with international status, so the second layer, with altogether a total of 7.4 million accessions in all of those registered seed banks. This is growing and growing, 1.4 million more than 10 years ago, and approximately 1 million today are considered to be unique. So anything else beyond the 2 million are to be considered as duplicate, redundancy, sometimes for good purposes, because we promote and we encourage seed banks to duplicate their accessions and store them in separate places. Next slide, please.
Just if you could wrap up, Stefan,
Yes.
because we are running a bit late.
Okay, yeah, just
already.
Okay, go through next slide. Okay, international collections, next slide. This is the Svalbard one. This is a safety duplicate. Next slide. Yeah, just slides, go through it, go through it, go through it. This is one of the boxes. This happened withdrawal after Syrian civil war, where the original ones had been destroyed, could be restored. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much.